could to ensure that tourists got to see animals at close quarters. The superintendent at Yellowstone, Horace Albright, who would later become director of the entire park system, pioneered this approach.
He believed that the animals should be more or less exhibited, like a zoo. You know, fence them and put them in these little enclosures and feed them, which is what a zoo is all about, and let the public see them that way as entertainment.
Partly to this end, Horace Albright maintained a captive breeding program for bison in Yellowstone.
For him, that meant visitors driving the roads see some bison off in the distance and think, oh, those are wild native bison, when in fact, discreetly concealed was the fence that kept them in view. You know, that was good enough for Horace, and actually it was probably good enough for almost all of the visitors of the time.
Most people in early 20th century America saw wild creatures in sentimental terms and as symbols of their frontier past. They did not yet appreciate the innate wildness of animals, nor the relationship between species. Ecology was still a science in its infancy.
There was this idea that there were good animals and bad animals. And the good animals were deer and elk and these pretty little herbivores that, you know, cavorted gaily in the meadows and ate grasses and did no harm, you know, and were idyllic. And the bad animals were predators, animals of the fang and claw. Human beings had this duty to protect the good animals from the bad animals, and that we should therefore manipulate. We should kill these bad animals and, you know, just shoot them.
Without understanding how ecosystems worked, men like Albright believed that killing predators would ensure larger numbers of the species that tourists wanted to see. So national parks joined other government agencies in eradicating predators. The last Yellowstone wolf was killed in 1926.
So by the time the Park Service has done all these things, it's a pretty ironic wilderness that's being created here. It's a kind of artificial construction of a wilderness that meets people's needs, that is kind of a domesticated wilderness, but it's hardly the authentic, real place that it purports itself to be.
The average tourist may have been satisfied with a tame version of wilderness. But for a new generation of wildlife managers, the situation was deeply troubling. These were people who hearkened back to the romantic ideal of wilderness as a place to encounter raw nature, but they were also schooled in the new science of ecology. The most influential of these was Aldo Leopold.
Aldo Leopold, he is the person who in the middle of the 20th century began to change the ideas of many Americans about what it was in wilderness that needed to be protected. He saw wilderness as an ecological baseline against which to compare all the systems that we had transformed. He was a passionate advocate of the primitive experience of the wild. And it is really Leopold's ideas that point toward what the wilderness of the second half of the 20th century and the wilderness of today really will become.
Aldo Leopold began his career with the United States Forest Service in New Mexico. And when he was working in New Mexico, he was a big advocate of protecting game through killing wolves and other predators. Now, Aldo Leopold changed his mind quite publicly about his own beliefs. He's one of these people with a rare ability to admit to having been wrong.
Leopold reversed his opinions on predators in an essay called Thinking Like a Mountain.
He describes killing, with a group of his friends, a mother wolf, and going down to the wolf as she's dying. And he looks into her eyes and sees what he calls a fierce green fire dying in those eyes, that speaks to him as what for him becomes a voice of the mountain, a voice of the wilderness itself, saying this animal has a role to play here, and in fact this animal is protecting this ecosystem. Those deer will destroy this ecosystem. This wolf is protecting those places.
Leopold's story was prophetic, and it was the management of Yellowstone's elk that eventually brought these ecological concerns to a head. Like bison, elk were popular with tourists, and in the early days the park managers had tried to boost their numbers by feeding them in winter and eliminating wolves.
By about 1910 to 1915, there was concerns over grazing. They saw soil erosion, they saw excessive browsing on the willows and the aspen species on it like that, and the berry-producing shrubs. And so people were worried that there were too many elk now, and that the elk were overgrazing the park.
To protect Yellowstone's willows, aspen and other vegetation, the Park Service tried to reduce the number of elk by trapping and translocating them to other parts of the West. But numbers still increased. In 1940, Aldo Leopold suggested reintroducing wolves to control the elk population, but few people countenanced the idea at the time. So elk numbers rose, and reluctantly the park began to cull them.
Rangers went out, and in the early 1960s killed thousands and thousands of elk. The peak was one year where they killed more than 3,000 elk in one winter. In doing that, they finally crossed a threshold of public tolerance.
It was a public relations disaster. Yellowstone announced they would stop the elk cull, but the government appointed an independent team of ecologists to look at how the National Park Service was managing its wildlife.
And then, lo and behold, in 1963, the scientific community issued what was called the Leopold Report. And that changed everything in national parks.
The report reflected a modern ecological view of wilderness and proposed a new mission statement for parks that would see them not just as tourist destinations, but as historically authentic ecosystems.
We would recommend that each park be maintained, or where necessary, recreated, as nearly as possible in the condition that prevailed when the area was first visited by the white man. A national park should represent a vignette of primitive America.
And this really